July the 18th, 2015. We are in Rockland, Maine, and with me today is Gary
Wheeler.
Wheeler. I lost
That's right.
lost your last name all of a sudden. And Gary's sort of an expert on the subject of unidentified flying objects and things related thereto. So, why don't you tell me your full name?
Gary Wheeler.
And where were you born?
I was born in Plainfield, New Jersey,
What year?
1943.
And you are
72.
you're younger than I am, actually.
I'm younger than you are.
And what did your parents do?
My father was like a ceramic engineer, and my mother was basically a mother, but also just did the interior design work.
And what is your education?
Pretty diverse, actually, but all through the time I was a kid, I worked as a carpenter, helping carpenters, and kept doing that basically throughout my life. But school-wise, I went to several different schools. I went to Ohio State and Denison University, and graduated from Ohio State, with a bachelor's degree, and then took off a year and traveled around the country, looking at things, and then I ended up at San Jose State in California, studying psychology, clinical psychology, and got my master's degree there, and finished there, came back to New Jersey, was painting at the time as an artist. I had some paintings, and I was selling some in a gallery, and I set up a little place to work, but it turned out the local town needed a school psychologist for the school system, so I worked there for a year or two, and then I was asked to take over a alternative school with 20 children who were all varied ages living on a farm, live in school. As I call them, they were socially malignant kids because parents really didn't want to deal with them, although the parents had money, but the kids were troublemakers, which also meant they were extremely intelligent and couldn't adapt to the school system. So this was an alternative school. And it worked fairly well for a couple of years, but then as everything, it had its own lifespan and died away. And then I started traveling around, and in my travels, it was much more practical to be a carpenter than it was to be a psychologist. So I worked as a carpenter, got into boat carpentry and sailing, became enamored with the whole concept of sailing, plus the structural functionality of a sailboat and what it takes to build a secure platform under those kind of stresses. So I got involved in a lot of sailboat work.
And I see you've authored a book about.
Yeah, I have a website because I designed a system for climbing the mast on a sailboat. It's called the Mastmate, which is an alternative to a bosun's chair. It's basically just a nylon alternating step flexible ladder that goes up the track.
That's a picture of it up there?
Yeah, that's a picture of it up there that goes up the track
on
a sailboat, and it allows, what it does is it allows the individual to do it alone. He doesn't need somebody to haul himself up there.
Is it a patented design?
Yeah, it was patented, yeah. Its patent's worn out by now, or gone out as 27 years ago or something. So
wow.
It's still being sold basically around the world, although I have certain rights to it within this country and stuff, so we manufacture them and I sell them. They're made in California.
Oh, wow.
I sell a couple hundred a year.
So somewhere along the line, you moved to Rockland, Maine.
Yeah, and the whole process, I went to Rockland. I ended up here, more or less.
Well, now, somewhere along the line, you developed an interest in unidentified flying objects, UFOs, as it were.
Right.
When did that happen, or how did that happen?
Well,
a brief headline, sort of thing.
Yeah, right. But I mean, it began probably when I was 10 years old or 11 years old, and saw the picture on the New York Times of the White House with 8, they said UFOs over the White House. And it was very evident that there was these structures, although they they weren't the typical looking thing. They more looked like plasma balls, but there was like 8 of them over the White House. They took the picture, and the headline said UFOs over, White House, and I got excited about the possibility of what that could mean, And then the next day, of course, the story all changed, and they tried to cover the whole thing up and said it was swamp gas or something that had produced those images. So anyway, that sparked my imagination, and over the years I had delved into different philosophies, and I always liked physics, so I had a pretty good understanding of how things work, or how we said they work, and so I was fascinated, and I had a couple of incidences that happened in my life that probably are too long to get into now, but they pointed me in the direction that something very odd had happened to me, and I couldn't fit it into the normal, what we call normal reality situations. And I happened about 10 years ago, 12 years ago, as circumstance has it, or more I should say serendipity has it, I ended up in a bookstore looking for a book about UFOs, and there was one book in the whole store, and the only book was called Abduction by John Mack, psychiatrist from Harvard University. And so I bought that book just to read about it, and within that book and within the stories that he told about some of his patients he worked with that had been abducted were stories that were very similar to what had happened to me. So I was kind of caught up into the whole idea: is this really real? Can this actually have really happened? And could I have been involved in it? And so what it did is it just made me almost maniacal about researching the subject. So the last 10 years I've researched all aspects of it to my satisfaction, to make me more aware of what the possibilities are.
So now, here in Rockland, you have a radio show.
Yeah, there's a little station here in Rockland called WRFR, and it's a community-owned station, nonprofit, all volunteer, all run by the individuals who were interested in radio. And somebody had heard that I was, for a while I taught about a 10-week course on UFOs at one of the little local schools here that we started ourselves, but about 20 people attended. And they were there almost every time for almost 20 sessions, and showed a lot of videos and had a lot of interviews, and it was very fascinating. But out of that came a guy who wanted to interview me for his radio show on WRFR, and so I did that. I did an interview with him, and then they suggested I had my own show and talked about it.
So how long have you been doing it?
I've done it just about a year now.
And is there a name for the show?
Yeah, it's called High Strangeness. And
High Strangeness.
It's on between 4 and 5 on Sundays, and it can be live streamed from the internet on WRFR.org. If you go there, there's a live streaming. You can listen to it online.
And that's Eastern Time?
That's Eastern Time.
Okay. Was it a call-in show? Or?
Well, it can be. Yeah, I try to make it that way, although I've had few call-ins, but I've had some.
Okay. You were mentioning books a minute ago. If a person was what would be the top 3 books to read on the subject?
Oh, geez, I think the most recent one probably that came out is very good for somebody who's skeptical and really doesn't needs some real background on the history of it, and also the validity or non-validity of the whole subject area was done by a woman named Keene, Social Security State, or something like that. But her book is probably a good first beginner. And then
was that the one that was just called Area 51?
No.
Was that one? I read that one. It was terrible.
No, yeah, some of them are horrible. But the best historian around the whole UFO is named Richard Dolan, and he has four different books out. 3 of which divide up by years the basic sightings of UFOs and the cover-up by the government. And this guy's a historian, so most of what he's talking about he doesn't fabricate.
And his name again?
Richard Dolan, Dolan,
And you mentioned one last night about something about things that were found, and a person wrote about.
Well, that's, yeah, I was going to mention that when you say that, from a beginner's standpoint, somebody who just wants to get into the understanding of what it's about, the one I mentioned is probably the best. And Dolan's book on UFOs and the national security state is excellent. And he has another one he just put out called After Disclosure, like what's going to happen, you know, when it's disclosed that these beings really exist and they have been around for a long time and they are interacting with our world, whether we like it or not. And that's Richard Dolan. Now, the one you're mentioning is a book called The Day After Roswell, and that was by a man named Philip Corso, who was a colonel, and this is sort of like a deathbed book where he got old and he wanted to get truthful about what he had been doing around the whole UFO thing for his grandchildren. He wanted to tell the truth, and so this book is, to him, it's a truth teller, and it's a expose of how many of the artifacts that were found at the Roswell crash site were picked up by the Army, and some of the things were so odd that they didn't have any idea what they were, and they just sort of threw them into a file. And Corso was given the assignment by, I think, General Twining, who was one of the high generals during that time, to find out what this material was and what it could do for us. And so he turned his stuff over to the industry, the free enterprise industry, to say, look, you guys take this stuff, see how it works, see what we can use, and give it to the military, but you can have the patents on it and everything. So basically, a lot of people believe that's where all these very quick advances happen with computer technology, and specifically with fiber optics. Apparently at the crash site of Roswell, there was all these filaments all over the place, and it was later found out that that's what this was fiber optics, and we didn't know what it was at the time. So that was his job. It's a very good book, very informative. A lot of controversy about it because a lot of people say, "Oh no, that's not possible." But again, a lot of these people who tell their stories are ex-professionals. They're either Army people or FBI or CIA somehow involved. So worth reading for sure. But I'll tell you, once you start reading this stuff, you don't stop, because I mean, you get really sucked in because it's so enticing.
Well, let's go forward to, let's just briefly,
sure.
There was a big Air Force examination called Project Blue Book. It ran for 12, 14 years, something like that.
Right, there was several of them, yeah. That was the major one, yeah.
Yeah, and the result of that was they came up with three things, apparently. One was, whatever they are, they're no threat to us.
Right, that was the main one, yeah.
Yeah, if somebody saw something, they probably really saw it. And what was the third one? What was the third one?
Well, I think 80% of, they said something like 90-some% were explainable, the sightings, but the reality was it was maybe 70%, not 90. But the within the UFO field, it sort of looked, that's kind of a laughing matter, because it's evident that over all these years, the government has basically been covering up their knowledge of what's going on, and so that any information that comes out from their research is very spurious. And there was not just the Blue Book, but there was also one in Colorado. The University of Colorado was given the assignment of...
Say that again?
University of Colorado was given the assignment to do the same thing, to research the whole UFO thing. They came up with basically the same conclusions. And so today, if the official word within the department, if you're asked about UFOs, is that is the Blue Book saying that we find them no threat to our national security. And so, in other words, we're saying we're not worried about it.
Well, there has not been anything to worry about.
Well, there has and there hasn't. I mean, there's been a lot of, that's part of the cover-up. I mean, there's very good evidence, as well as witnesses that UFOs were seen over Minuteman silos when the missiles were shut down. And this has happened 4 or 5 times in this country and also in Russia, where the missiles have been taken over by something else other than us. And it was done in such a way that it was basically impossible for 10 missiles to all go down at the same time, because they're all independently controlled. And they never came out with a good enough solution about what that was about. But the witnesses that all came forward were soldiers and stuff who saw the UFOs over the facility when it occurred.
As I recall, the real interest in this became 1946 or 47. The guy flying a private airplane, he was passed by some, as he called them, flying saucers down below him.
Right.
And then after that, it sort of generated, and then there were more and more sightings. And I was looking at that MUFON site yesterday, and it just showed thousands of sightings all over the place, including 3 in my neighborhood in the last month. And if that happened, I wasn't aware of it.
Right. Well, no, but how many are? I mean, how many people spend time looking up or to see something?
Every time I hear an airplane.
Well, you do, but I mean, most people aren't looking at the sky.
I mean, I don't care what it is. If I hear any kind of an airplane noise, I'm looking up.
Well, the average is 600 reports a month come in through this country alone of sightings. Now, you can do what you want with that information, but in proportion, you can triple that around the world. Because it's a world event. It's not something that's just occurring in our culture.
Well, I have 2 main questions I want
Sure.
to ask, but let me get to those in a minute. But before we do, you've interviewed Bob Lazar, correct?
I haven't interviewed him. I've listened to tapes of his being interviewed.
Right.
Right.
Now, he's talking about hardware.
Well, he was talking about working at, not right at Area 59, but at Groom Lake, which is right next to Area 51.
Right.
And he claims that he was brought in to help to diagnose the power systems on these UFOs. How are they powered?
And so he claims to have seen one, and I presume, I mean, I've seen, they made a model of it. I mean, you can buy the
He said
model.
they saw 9 of them. He said there's 9 hangars that are carved into a mountain south of Area 51.
Where the hell would they get them?
I mean, that's a whole other question. I mean, there's all kinds of questions. But
I've just heard there was one. I never, because I've read about him before. I mean, I've read about him.
Oh, Lazar, he's very well known because he's a good comparison with Lazar is Snowden today, who released all that NASA information.
Right.
Now Snowden was totally discredited and everything, but the reality was
I don't think he's been discredited.
Well, he was discredited because he didn't have the education to do what he was doing. Part of the whole discreditation of Lazar was the fact that he didn't have the education to be working on nuclear stuff. Well, what we're finding out, of course, we've known this, but is in the science community, when somebody's good at something, they don't care what your education is. If you can do it, that they want you, especially on this very high technical problem-solving stuff. So anyway, he was supposedly brought in to do this, and he says he was, and he investigated the power systems. He came to his own conclusions about how these things were powered, and it was definitely an anti-gravity system that was using some sort of uranium isotope. With the power system, he said that they were anti-gravity devices of some sort that got their energy from some sort of rare uranium element that doesn't exist naturally but can be made, and he actually had a bit of it. But so I mean, the story goes on and on and on from people who will kind of put down what he said versus those who are very supportive of what he said. So like everything with the UFO community, you can either become a believer in the sense of doing the research and coming to your own conclusion, or let others make up your mind for you. But
so so we've had sightings in the 40s and the 50s continuing through.
Well, the sightings mainly began in the 40s because what they believe, and what people who have been abducted and communicated with these other beings have said is that they showed up because of the nuclear weapons that we were developing. And our nuclear power is something that apparently threatens more than just ourselves.
So this is the scenario of the day the Earth stood still with Michael Rennie.
Basically, it's something like that,
Yeah,
but
right.
it's also saying that we don't, some of the things we don't know, we don't know the effects it has on other dimensions. And what they're saying is nuclear energy and nuclear power
there's the segue I was looking for.
can start messing with other dimensions.
Well, so the question is it a dimensional thing, or is it actually someone coming for places outside the Earth?
Yeah. Well, it could be both. It could be one or the other, but most likely it's both.
Well, that's what I was thinking about Lazar. I mean, if there's hardware, unless that hardware shifts dimensions.
Well, it does, because I think what happens is when they come into, I mean, this is just physics. The physics that we have, or the human beings think we have, doesn't necessarily apply to these other beings, or it doesn't apply to the dimension they function on. So our three-dimensional physics doesn't necessarily fit a fourth-dimensional being, or a fourth-dimensional environment, or a fifth or sixth. But what's happening, interestingly, is this whole thing about dimensions and environments is something that we're coming up with through physics on our own, not because of the UFOs. Because now, of course, quantum physics is basically, saying that there's like 12 different dimensions that we're dealing with all the time. And so it's very, very conceivable that these other beings, first of all, it's almost evident that they have the capability of moving between dimensions, but actually how they utilize that capability, I'm not sure. But I know when they come into the third dimension, they have to have third dimensional dynamics about them. So the fact that they have craft, or the fact that they have a physical presence, it may be only on this dimension.
Well, the reports you normally think of seeing are the people with the big eyes, and I guess there's two different. There's the grays, which are the small ones.
There's several different ones. I mean, the most popular image anyway is the small gray with the big eyes, large forehead. In fact, it's interesting because the first book.
Anybody ever taken a picture of one that's
no,
real?
But
a real picture.
Yes, they say they have it. Who knows? Everything could be fake today, so you don't know. But the interesting part was when the first book came out about abduction. I forget the author, but on the cover of the book was an artist's rendering of what this abductee said they looked like. And it was basically what we see today as that popular image, except the forehead was small and certain things were different. And what happened is when the book came out and people saw the cover, the publisher got all this phone calls saying, that's not what they look like. You got this wrong, you got that wrong. So, I mean, it was very interesting that they had this kind of response from people. Now, again, one has to imagine what's in people's minds versus what is reality. But the whole problem with this field, when you get into it, is what is reality and what isn't becomes a real mind tickler.
Well, isn't there a lady that says she has some sort of pipeline to some voice? And
there's several people claim they have the ability to communicate with them. It's hard to. I mean, there's a man in Switzerland, Billy Meyer, who lives in a little cabin up in the mountains, and he has probably the greatest photo supply of pictures of UFOs in the world. That he's taken on his mountain, that they come and visit him all the time. And he's been tried again. He's been discredited and tried to be discredited in many ways, but I mean, the guy is not a super photography technician, nor is he. And he only has one arm, and he has all these photographs. So, and he claims he has volumes of material that he says he's been given by. He said these are Pleiadians. These are people from the planet, the Pleiades, or
Well,
beings.
the Pleiades aren't. I mean, just because they look like they're close together in our sky doesn't mean they're really that close together.
Well,
They could be
no.
hundreds of millions of light years
Well, yeah, but it
apart.
has nothing to do with it. He just says that's who these beings are.
Oh, that's they say
Yeah.
that's their address.
That's their address, basically. And
It's in the winter sky, straight above.
yeah, and it's interesting. You know, did you ever look at the emblem on the Subaru Japanese
Right, yeah.
car? You notice the stars.
Yeah, it's the Pleiades. Yeah,
That's that's
the seven,
Pleiades.
the seven sisters.
Yeah, and because the Japanese believe that's where they're from.
Oh, really?
It's part of their tradition. Yeah.
No, I didn't know that.
Yeah. There you go. Learning more all the time.
Yeah. So, you just talked about Billy Meyer. Any other? I've never heard that name before.
Oh yeah, well, he's one of the most prominent.
Well, have you ever talked to anybody? I mean, personally, that's besides yourself, that
Oh yeah, no, I talked to several people, or several people come forward to me to tell
tell
me their stories.
what's the most logically, what was I say? Which one has the most veracity? Tell me that story.
Well, I mean, again, it's that whole reality question. Where do you go with that? I mean, I've had several people tell me that they had experiences where they were actually on some sort of ship, and that they actually looked back on the Earth, and they were communicated with by through telepathy with these beings, telling them about the Earth and what we were doing to it, and that how this had to stop, or we were going to destroy the planet. And
well, so
now, and the problem is with these
if
stories,
we're destroying the planet, why would they threaten to destroy the planet if we're already destroying
they're
it?
not going to destroy the planet. No, if they're going to destroy anything, it's us. For destroying the planet, they want to save the planet. The planet's important. Although my feeling is that we are actually part of them. That our genetics, I believe, has been manipulated by them, and we are not evolutionary what we think we are. I think we are a hybrid of them and other normal evolutionary processes. But there's a lot of, the more we've gotten into the genome project and looking at our chromosomes, it's very apparent that there has been times in history where they've been messed with. That somehow genes have been literally welded together where that can't happen through nature.
So some people have said they've been. I mean, I've read this before too,
Yeah.
where they've been taken up in a spaceship where they can look down,
Right.
and that's what I don't understand. What is the point of taking them up in the sky if these beings can shift from one dimension to another down here on Earth? Why do they need to take people up in the sky?
Because that's our world. I mean, that's how we see the world. I mean, they can do what they want.
Have they ever taken? Have you ever read a story or heard about someone being taken from our dimension into their dimension?
I haven't heard about cross-dimensional with human beings. No, I'm sure that might be out there, but I haven't heard it.
Well, that'd be.
There's not much that is. I'll tell you.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's John Mack's book.
John Mack's book called Abduction.
Okay.
And he's a psychiatrist at Harvard, and he taught psychiatry there.
How do you spell his last name?
Mack, M-A-C-K, John Mack.
Okay.
And he.
What was the other name? Was it Dolan? That was
Richard Dolan, D-O-L-A-N. Yeah. But Mack is a great one to read because he was such a skeptic, and by interviewing these people, he kept trying to find something that would indicate that they had some sort of psychological issue that created these stories. And yet, what really got him was the fact that so many of the stories were alike. So many people told basically the same story about being abducted and what had happened to them and what their experiences were.
But if you're going to, make a change in the way we, conduct our world, wouldn't you want to do it with some sort of government leaders? Or
well, yeah, but see, you're going from one of the problems we have with this whole issue is that every time we try to analyze what they're doing, we're doing it from a human being logic of looking at something. Now, we don't know at all what their logical system is or how they would approach a problem. It's evident that if all this is basically true, there is some sort of limitation that they place on themselves about how much they will do or won't do to change what's going on with us. Now, I have a feeling that's because we are part of them, and their genetic work with the human being isn't over yet, that they're still doing it, because there's over the years of the abductions, and of course there were the cattle mutilations where all kinds of mutilation was taking place amongst cattle.
Is that still going on?
It still goes around once in a while, but it was much more prevalent back in the 80s and 90s.
And the crop circles seem to be getting...
Crop circles are getting more and more complicated every year. Yeah, I mean, that to me is the number one thing that any skeptic or doubter, if they study the crop circles, they have to walk away and say, something's going on that is not of this earth. Because the way that wheat is bent, and they've studied it, and it's heated through some sort of microwave that bends the wheat and doesn't destroy it. Where when we go in to make them with our planks and all this stuff, which we can do, it breaks everything. It ruins the harvest.
And they're perfect.
They're perfect. They're absolutely perfect and geometrically perfect.
Yeah,
Plus, we believe there's all kinds of messages hidden within the geometry. So it's a complicated issue, but I mean, it's a mind blower. I mean, to look at these things, you just have to walk away shaking your head.
I was looking at the book downstairs.
Yeah, I mean, it's
And I
just...
saw the little light,
Yeah.
the picture of the light, which says
Oh
flash.
yeah, well now they've actually had video people now that have set up cameras, and they've caught these balls of light going around the field at, you know, super speeds, apparently creating.
Well, I mean, some of the more complicated ones, it would take you days to do that, not just a matter of over the night.
But that's our days, not their days. And it's not how do we know we don't know the kind of energy they're using to make this happen. So it seems to happen almost instantaneously when these balls do their jumping around things. So there's those kind of mysteries that are just really have to go down as non-explainable. Now, you can make your own conclusions, but somebody's doing it. And these aren't natural phenomena. It's caused by a weather system, which they tried to say for a while.
Well, what I understand is, why not, if you really want to make the point, why not land on the Capitol Mall like they did with the
Well, in a sense, they said they already did that. Well, and there's a whole scenario around the fact that Eisenhower met with him back on Andrews Air Force Base on a runway back in the 50s and worked out some sort of an arrangement around their involvement with the human race. And there were soldiers that witnessed this taking place at the end of an airport, although there weren't many who were right there and listened to the conversation. But again, that's one of those stories that, is it just a story? Or, well, with all these stories, like with any story, there's probably a grain of truth somewhere, but what it is exactly, we don't know. But it's apparent that it's believed within the UFO community that there is a whole black operations within our government structure that's directly involved with the whole UFO thing, and has been for a long time. But it stays totally hidden.
So I wonder what Mulder and Scully are going to come out with this summer.
Well, that's interesting. Yeah, now that because when you're watching the field, the UFO field, and watching the public's reaction to UFO issues, it's changed drastically. Fortunately, over the last 10 years.
How's that?
Well, before, if anything happened, people always mocked it and made fun of people who said they saw something, and it got so bad that people who did see something wouldn't come forward because they were made fun of. They were made a mockery, and there were several stories. There's one that took place in Gulf Breeze. The guy who wrote a book about it, his name is Wilson. He had several sightings with all kinds of pictures. Not only did he have sightings, the whole town had sightings, and yet he had to end up leaving town because of the press that he got around the whole thing. So, but now it seems to be more and more acceptable. If there is something seen, it's not made fun of immediately. On the newscast, you don't hear, "Oh, they saw little green men." You don't hear that so much with a little chuckle in their voice. They say, "Well, something was seen. They don't know what it is." But they don't make fun of it anymore. So slowly it's sneaking into the culture. And now with this new Pope Francis, who's definitely a truth teller, he might be the one to bring it up, to have a real dialogue about what's going on. which is fascinating.
So, if you were to write a headline, what would it be?
Disclosure coming.
And then after that?
Hold on.
No, but I mean, so what do you? So I guess it's kind of like what is going on? I mean, what do you think is going on?
Well,
I think you've already said it, but you can say it.
Yeah.
Again.
Well, no, I think it's subtly that there is acceptance that this thing is possible. I mean, more and more you hear little stories about, oh, life is possible, this and that and that. More little indications that, hey, it's not going to be that big a shock if all of a sudden they stand up and say, well, the truth is, this has been going on for a while, and these creatures do exist. Apparently they are no threat to us, so don't be afraid. It's just that they are concerned about our planet, and they may want to interact with us in such a way as to help us out of the mess we're in, or to, but the one thing they don't want is hostility, and apparently that's how we approach everything that's foreign to us. We want to attack it. So the fear is that...
Well, can't we get those guys over to the Middle East and get those guys straightened down a little bit?
Well, yeah, but the problem is if we don't have them, then we're going to have to find another one, another enemy. And who's going to make all these weapons? We've got to have somebody buy all these weapons. I mean, the biggest part of our whole problem is our economic structure is built around war and weapons and oil, and the more it becomes apparent that these other beings are using alternative energies, which are just massively more powerful and better to use than what we do.
Yeah, but they never use the weapons.
They don't use the weapons. We use the weapons. I mean, we're producing weapons all the time to use against each other, and that's basically, we've been told that's why we haven't been back to the moon. That we were told by these other beings, like, this is as far as you go, as travel into space as a human race, until you get rid of your aggressive natures and your violence. We're not going to let you progress further into space. So, which is interesting, I mean, it's a possibility, because one certainly wonders, all of a sudden NASA shut down awful fast, and
well, they ran out of money.
Well, they ran out of money, but who runs out of money when you have something you really want to do? They would have found the money. But I think they were looking for a way out, because they knew that...
Well, the Vietnam War was...
Well, no, I know that.
And it was all this, it ended all at the same time, pretty much.
Well, yeah, but there's no reason the space program had to end. I mean, they would have sunk more money into going to Mars or whatever. No, I think there's really good evidence that we...
Say that again.
That I think what the ETs are extraterrestrials or extra dimensionals, whatever you want to call them. I prefer to use the term others now, because nothing else really fits.
So it's ET, ED,
yeah,
or others.
Others, yeah. And others just leaves it more wide open, I suppose, to whatever it could be, the reality of it. But I think they're waiting for us to develop further. And of course, in our sense of time, and their sense of time might be totally different things altogether, how long this will take. But they do know the limits the Earth has in absorbing what we're doing.
Well, if they're in a different dimension, are they living on the same Earth, you suppose? Are they eating the same wheat and having the same...
Well, that's like asking, where's the fourth dimension? Right? How do you say where the fourth dimension is? Is it, or is the whole idea of...
Why would they be concerned about the Earth if they were not of and part of the Earth?
Well, because I think they have to function on all dimensions. It's not just once you move, like say to the fifth or fourth dimension, that's where you function all the time. I think once you advance into other dimensions, you're still functioning in all others at the same time. So I think that what we see as a material world, when you really look into the physics of everything, it's all frequency waves. Everything is frequency waves. There's no such thing as matter as we think of matter. It's all frequency waves at different amplitudes that create these
I'll tell you, I was writing I write newspaper articles.
Sure.
And so I decided I wanted to see if I could write a book. So I thought, well, I'll write a couple of short stories. And so my natural interest for me always turns to science fiction. And I remember how it worked out, but it was something along the line of some guy gets beamed up into a spaceship, but they don't realize that he's armed, and so he starts shooting the little guys, you know. And then when he does that, then he finally ends up talking to a person who is actually going to control the ship, a regular person like you or I.
Right.
And when he does, then they start the dialogue about what's going on. And the fellow explains that the reason he was out, you know, over the sands of New Mexico, or you know, he was just kind of driving around low level, is because he's looking for water sources, tracing old underground water sources, because he's from a different time, and he's, you know, and I guess he doesn't even realize he's shifting back and forth. And he asks if the time went back to a split in time, where, I mean, this is just me thinking, you know, a split in time probably caused by the atomic bomb, where they diverged, and he was wondering if President Ford was still in charge of the company, meaning President Henry Ford.
Yeah, right. Yeah, right.
You know, and so there was a
right.
whole different structure.
Yeah.
And I think, as I recall, it was like, you know, the shifting back and forth. He may not even been aware of it, and he was in a different time period.
In some ways, I think that's probably very possible to happen. And it's something we may do all the time and not even aware that we do it. You know?
Yeah, maybe when you fall asleep at night,
that's what I was going to say.
Go someplace
at nighttime,
else.
you might be going into other dimensions.
Yeah.
And I think possibly with these psychedelic drugs and things, I think that was part of what happened.
No, I never tried that.
Well, our brain basically has a bunch of filters. You know, we filter out an awful lot stuff that's coming at us, and the psychedelic drugs seem to open the door on those filters.
So your bottom line on the whole thing is, it seems like there's kind of a split. There's the hardware part of it, where the people could come from someplace else,
right?
And if they have 9 of them or 1 of them, why haven't they taken them back? It seems like that'd be pretty easy for them to do. Number 2, why haven't we used them? You know, as advanced as the SR-71 was at the time, it still is just an airplane.
Well, if you go and look at the SR-71, came out of Lockheed Skunk Works, right? And the head of the Skunk Works was named Ben Rich. And during those time that they developed the SR-71,
actually Kelly Johnson was still involved. Ben Rich
was there, but he in one of his last talks he gave, he was asked, you know, how advanced are our abilities, our space abilities, and he basically said, we can take ET home. And I don't know if that was just the off-the-cuff remark.
I think it was.
It might have been indicating that there's a belief that we have a lot of the capabilities.